Friendly! Friendly!
Who are you? Who sent you?
Nobody. There was an accident down on the road and... What's going on?
Oh no. They're coming.
Who is? What the hell was that?
You have a gun?
What?
Please tell me you have a gun.
No, why would I?
Take it! Take it! Help me, South Road.
Hey, are you listening?
Hey!
What the...
Resident Evil Village follows Ethan Winters as he travels to a snowy European village after his daughter is kidnapped. Atmosphere. Resident Evil Village continues on from Resident Evil 7 and does a similar job with the atmosphere. The level design is incredible, from hanging goat heads that decorate the village, to dilapidated houses full of broken furniture and crumbling structures, swamps full of strange creatures, and illustrious castles decorated like the Spencer Mansion. The game really has a great attention to detail, and its environments are both rich and varied, but whilst most of these locations can be imposing to begin with, they don't hold up their initial wonder or mystique for the entire time you spend in them. The soundtrack only turns up when something is happening, and for a large portion of the game you find yourself searching through cupboards and exploring its various locations, and there's no enemies or soundtrack to fill these moments with any tension of any kind. On the other hand, the boss fights are full of dramatic music and big set pieces that were both exciting and fun. The cutscenes are well shot and sometimes emotional, but for a large portion of the gameplay there's just nothing, and when the combat stops, it makes even walking through a room full of blood or walking past hanging goat heads seem like nothing at all. The game does a great job of making the environments look really wonderful, but most of the time the atmosphere doesn't reflect this. It was jarring to be standing in the middle of a giant hall with various enemies on the loose and not feel threatened thanks to the relative ease to avoid enemies and succeed during combat. Something that hurts the atmosphere is just how most of the game takes place during the daytime. Many of the locations would probably be infinitely more frightening if they took place at night, and a few sections of the game that take place in the dark are both intense and filled me with apprehension. But as always, the sun rises. There were only one or two parts in the game where the atmosphere turned up, and it was refreshing to see. In the Beneviento house, there's a section where the lights go out, you're stripped of weapons and left roaming for an exit in the dark, and is by far the most tense part of the game. You know something is down there with you, a mysterious trail of blood leaves you thinking something large is in the area, and you aren't wrong. It's a shame that the rest of the game doesn't really use this kind of thing more often. Instead it turns out to be the most atmospheric moment in the game. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. The zombies have given way to the lichens, which are more feral in appearance, and despite being more unpredictable in their movement, they're all really the same when it comes to shooting them. It can get a bit frightening when they all appear at once and swarm the player, but it's rare to be without some ammunition, I found. The combat itself isn't very frightening, with the abundance of weapons and ammunition available to the player, plus the precision of a first-person camera angle means for less wasted shots. On the standard setting, I found the game surprisingly easy, and as a result was less frightened of things going wrong during combat. There's an all-star cast of prominent antagonists, from the towering Lady Dimitrescu to the possessed doll, the horribly mutated swamp monster, the Magneto clone Heisenberg, and finally, Mother Miranda. But only Lady Dimitrescu actively chases you around her castle, and it's not really frightening either. She takes a long time to duck to get through doors and was generally very easy to avoid. There's some scripted sections where she caught me off guard until I realised there was nothing I could do about it. But again, there was only one part of the game that was truly frightening, and it's the same dark basement as before. After assembling a doll, the light goes out, you lose your weapons, and then the giant mutated baby appears. Its grotesque appearance and disturbing giggling seem almost out of place with the rest of the game, as it's genuinely horrifying. Not being able to fight it and having to hide from it and try and outmaneuver it were by far the most frightening parts of the game. Overall, it misses out on that fear that the seemingly immortal Jack Baker inflicted in that house in Louisiana, and whilst the antagonists here are very memorable, they're just not scary. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The soundtrack is mostly orchestral, and listening to the tracks themselves reveals a lot of great unnerving pieces, but it was greatly overshadowed by the amount of silence the game leaves the player in whilst roaming the village. It really feels like the soundtrack only comes in to accentuate big moments like boss fights or other large fight sections. It definitely helps to build the dread in the basement of the Beneviento house, but it still feels like the biggest missed opportunity of the game. The voice acting is absolutely top-notch, from the gravelly voice of Chris Redfield to the strained, garbled mess of Moreau. The character voices are done really well and feel really natural. Something that's also stellar is the sound effects. It's incredibly realistic stuff, and thanks to the lack of soundtrack, they fill in every moment to make things more believable, from Ethan's footsteps and breathing to the sound of the wind blowing. Directional audio is also flawless, and the sound space is very realistic and immersive. It's the kind of detail you expect from a game of this size and caliber, and it delivers. Whilst I feel the lack of soundtrack is really the thing that makes the game suffer the most, everything else around it is absolutely flawless. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. The gore isn't as over the top and vile in the same way as it was in Resident Evil 7, but this game certainly has a load of disgusting moments thanks to the various mutations of the Cadeau and Ethan losing more body parts and having to endure the game's events with just 3 fingers on his left hand right until the end. There's lots of cool moments, from stabbing a doll in the head with a pair of scissors and blood coming out to the blood basement mentioned earlier on. It's sometimes strange and surreal, but graphically presented in a realistic way, which I find both gross but also highly entertaining. That's 2 Harry Masons.
Long ago, a young girl went with her mother to pick berries for her father, who was hard at work. But the forest greeted them with a dark, cold silence, the bushes empty. Yet determined to find the berries, the rascal broke free from Mother's grasp and vanished into the trees. Mother's worried cries faded fast as the girl ran on, over vine and under branch, and into the forest deep. Feeling strange eyes upon her, the girl recalled Mother's scary bedtime tales, and her throat became bone dry. Then the Bat Lord appeared. He greeted her warmly and bit his own wing. "Come, child, quench your thirst," he said. So she drank the thick, dark blood and smiled with joy. Passing through the graveyard, menacing storm clouds loomed, and the air turned bitingly cold. The girl was shivering in her thin clothes. Then a dark weaver appeared, and with a click of his fingers crafted mist into a beautiful dress. "Come, child, warm yourself," he coaxed. So she clothed herself and smiled with joy. Across waters deep and ominous she went, hoping a boat she found would carry her home. But hunger's grip tightened and her heart grew heavy. Then the Fish King appeared and offered one of his many fins. "Come, child, eat your fill." So the girl ate and smiled with joy once more. Continuing on, she soon entered the forest's dark heart. Then an iron steed appeared, bearing a beautiful golden gear. The creature said nothing as the girl approached and snatched what she thought was another gift. The horse grew angry and summoned the other monsters. Terror filled the girl's heart as the wild wind rose around the beasts. Suddenly, a witch appeared, dark yet regal.
Story. This installment follows the events of Resident Evil 7 and sees Ethan and his wife Mia taking care of their daughter Rose when suddenly Chris Redfield has Mia shot and takes Rose with him. After being knocked unconscious, Ethan wakes up in the wreckage of a car crash in the village. The story feels more like a return to older entries in the series, mirroring the style and antagonists of Resident Evil 4, but it feels as though Ethan himself is out of place for this. It's fairly linear, you're introduced to the antagonists and you defeat them one at a time until they're all dead. During my time playing, I couldn't shake the feeling that all the important facts were being deliberately withheld from Ethan until the very end, with everyone talking in riddles or being unhelpful. It's hard to say the story is amazing. A lot of plot points don't seem to make sense. It often feels like a spin-off with so many things introduced that seem out of place, and even when things are finally explained, especially about Ethan and his ability to reattach lost limbs, it just feels convenient and something that should have really been explained in the previous game. The game's story isn't a huge focus as much as its gameplay and set pieces, and it does push the events of the game along, but it really only starts to make sense near the very end, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. Resident Evil Village is by no means a bad game. It's extremely enjoyable and I had a ton of fun playing it from start to finish. Its horror elements are mostly in its visual presentation with its brilliant attention to detail and design of its locations and antagonists, but for the most part it's just not frightening in any way. It's almost frustrating that they come so close to making a genuinely great horror experience, but only do it for 20 minutes of a 5-hour game. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, so if you don't share this opinion then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I lost a fair few limbs, I certainly did not scream like a banshee or run over the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Let's go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.